Right, well, good morning to you all. It is still good morning for the next 3/4 of an hour, and a little bit after that, we're going to have a really interesting session. I'm Steve Wheeler, I'm your host for this session, and I'm really looking forward to it. Hope you are too, otherwise you wouldn't be here, would you? How are you feeling, all right? Yeah. Had a bit too much falling down water last night, I don't know. Some people did. But I hope you're up for this, because there's going to be a lot of interaction going on, I think. We've got a very interesting session, which, as you can see, is about digital shifts. I know lots of events throughout history have propelled technology forward. Obviously, the pandemic is the latest one, and it's caused a lot of shifts in the way we work, the way we operate, the way we think even. And that's another reason why I'm interested in this session, because these two guys on stage with me now have a lot of data at their hands, a lot of years of data that they've accumulated, and they're looking at trajectories, they're looking at trends, they're looking at what might happen in terms of the pragmatic aspects of working with technology, or through technology and with technology, in a post-pandemic age, whenever that happens. We don't know, because we're still in that pandemic time, aren't we? So, but without any further ado, I'd like to give a warm welcome from Fosway, these two guys, David Wilson, David Perry. I've got to get them right. Please welcome them.
Good morning from me. Yeah. And lovely to be here in person. I'm sure we've had a lot of speakers say that. So very much appreciating actually being out in the real world again and seeing what's going on, etc. So I'm David Wilson, I'm CEO, founder and CEO of Fosway. David Perry, so we'll just call it David. He's our Director of Research, and we're going to talk to you today about the research that we've been doing, obviously on an ongoing basis, but particularly in terms of 2022, in understanding what the shape of digital learning and corporate learning is as we emerge into a sort of post-pandemic world, whatever, as Steve said, that happens to turn out to be, or whenever that reality actually turns out to happen. Obviously, we don't know what forks in the road we have going forward. So what we're going to focus on really is talking to you about what we call our digital learning realities research, which is the thing we run every year with learning technologies. I think we're in our 7th or 8th year of running it. Yeah. And it's really trying to understand the shape of what's going on. You know, what are you doing? Who are you doing it with? What works? What doesn't? Trying to really focus on really thinking about a little bit of contextual slides, and then really focusing on how is it changing. Some data points. There's lots of slides with graphics and data on. We'll provide access to the slides afterwards if you want them. By all means, take pictures if you want to take pictures, although the resolution isn't always great. Then really focusing on kind of where that's then going from, what's the consequences of that, talking specifically around digital fatigue, and some of the things to think about. We're just taking a subset of some of the research, so we'll try to kind of bring in a few things that we think are important. Then talk about skills, which is obviously a topic that is all over the place. But in particular, I think one of the challenges for this audience, as particularly learning and development professionals, is to talk about the land grab that's going on around skills and where that's coming from, and in particular from the wider HR marketplace and so on. That's a really important thing. And then finally, we're going to just touch on a little bit around vendor landscape and how, and our Fosway 9 grids, talking about digital learning and learning systems, and then probably just go into questions. So that's the overall flow today. So let me focus on, let's just set in some context slides, and then David's going to really talk through some of the detailed research. So, I mean, this is kind of blindingly obvious. The world changed, very, very rapidly a couple of years ago. All of the direct impacts from the pandemic, and then in through to the impacts that we're now seeing in terms of understanding, the decisions around what does employment, what does work look like, what does the workforce look like in that kind of post-pandemic world. There's a few very obvious things that we know companies are really dealing with this. Well, where are the workers? You know, are they in the office? Are they working from home? Are they hybrid? What does hybrid mean? If we said they're going to be mainly in the office and now we're working out that that's really not that easy to do, or we're going to say they're mainly at home and we've worked out that that's maybe not what we want from a business productivity point of view, where are we landing around that? And there's obviously lots of data points around that. We just picked a couple of things, you know, 2/3 of some research from Computer Weekly, I think, from it originally. So 2/3 of employees expecting to work from home or from no fixed location. Companies, 84%, this is I think from our research as well, around looking at how they accelerate their approach towards flexible and home working. This is a huge conversation at the moment, and obviously some very big companies are potentially into quite challenging. Apple recently, obviously, making the press in the last few days around the strategy they now want and real pushback from the employee base around it. Overall, this is some data that we did last year, looking at it around what do we expect from companies' perspective, where they want to be, where do they want to be. So typically companies are largely looking for people in the workplace probably 3 days a week. Obviously there's a variation. Interestingly, this pattern, funny enough, looks very different if you ask the employees where they want to be. Right? And that's obviously ultimately the challenge that we're trying to deal with. Why is this important? Is when we understand what we want to do from a learning perspective, we need to understand where our audience is. You know, we need to understand how we engage them. And one of the things that I talk a lot with companies around is if hybrid workplace is your norm, that means you have to be digitally enabled as the norm. Right? Because the moment it's about physical programs, and this is really, really important when we talk about high value learning. If we expect them to be in an office or in a training centre or in a business school, we've immediately disenfranchised all those people that are not working from that office. Right? So we've got big issues, and we'll see more and more happen with that. 50%, half the people said they would quit if they weren't allowed to do remote, if remote working was the only option. It's kind of interesting, we big up a lot around the advantage of it, and there's clearly generational data around this as well. And I think probably in overall terms, I think the sort of point I would say going into this is nobody really understands. They have an idea, they have a plan, but as Mike Tyson says, you have a plan until somebody punches you in the face. So the reality is with the plans around where we see these being, very few companies have yet had the maturity and the experience to understand how that's going to happen and how that impacts their talent pipelines with the decisions they subsequently make. Strangely enough, therefore, as a consequence, companies have had to rapidly change their strategy into things about, from an L&D point of view, how they deal with it. When we did some original COVID research, we had sort of 95% of companies saying that they changed their L&D strategy as a result of the pandemic. Well, that's not a surprise. But what's interesting is how many people think they're going to go back. It's very small. So you can see the sort of level of changes around it, and it's kind of interesting. I always think about with the 9%. 9% say they've made no changes. What does that mean? What was their business operating model before that if they make no changes? So all of that sets a context really around understanding. It's no good just thinking about learning and learning experiences and shift to digital in isolation. We need to think about it within the real workplace.
And I think one of the things to reflect on around 50% wanting to be in the office is there's an element of personalisation. It's trying to make sure that the employee experience or that learning experience is actually tailored to the individual. And that's probably one of the biggest things that comes out of research. So is that sort of how do you create a flexible environment that works for me? So it's not about employee experience, it's the me experience, it's the ME experience. MEX is probably what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to fall off the stage. Very careful. Okay, yes. So how will organisations look to invest around the L&D over the year? What you have told us, because this is your input into us, and we've had about 350 people feed into this. Most of you said you're going to increase your L&D budget. It's not 40% increase, it's 40% of you expect that to increase. The vast majority, to some extent, the area that I'm not showing, are going to stay the same. But what I wanted to do is almost show the swingometer. There's a big number in the middle, there's a small number who are going to decrease, but you never know what they were going to how much they spent in the past anyway. But there is the momentum towards development and people, which is very refreshing for us, and hopefully very rewarding for your learners as well, because you're able to spend more. The other thing that we've asked related to this is, so what are you investing in from a digital learning content perspective? So where are you going to, what are you going to invest in? You're going to invest in content, you're going to invest in platforms, you're going to invest in services, digital learning team. Are you going to outsource your digital learning team? And again, the swing is actually we're investing more in digital. Otherwise, everybody saying it's all the same. So again, you get the sense of this sort of momentum being much more about the content and the platforms, and actually it's about extending our internal team. And maybe that swing between outsourcing is starting to shrink a little bit. Not necessarily, there's still momentum across every area, but that sort of push is into push the content, push the platforms, push the services. And as I'll see maybe in this one, is to do that ourselves a little bit more, and to do it through our own subject matter experts a little bit more. So again, sort of asking, how are you planning to resource projects? What are you going to do? Are you going to source it yourselves? Are you going to outsource it to others? Are you going to get somebody not in the room to do it, subject matter experts? So again, this balance of there's still a strong momentum. It's not about sourcing to external suppliers. Still overall pushing towards more expenditure. But when you look at hiring full-time employees, that's growing. Looking at contractors to work on specific projects, and that's expanding. Using external contractor marketplace, actually just going to a marketplace and saying, are there anybody external who can do this for me? That's a little bit 50-50. But when you look at the internal marketplace and using subject matter experts, that's where it seems as though our digital learning, from what you've told us, seems to be headed. That's where we're moving in terms of, almost becoming a more democratized approach to developing learning content and enabling learning within our organizations. Now, I'm not sure if that echoes the people in the room, but that's what you've told us. So hopefully that does make sense. It does correlate to your experience. If it doesn't, it'd be helpful to see a little bit of body movement, just to get a sense of who's in the room. But it just, I think it's really interesting. So massive move to digital still increased investment around digital learning. And where are they going to look to invest? Is it in user-generated content? Is it in bespoke content or off-the-shelf content? It seems as though our off-the-shelf content sort of focus is just quieting down a little bit. There's still momentum in that direction. But user-generated content, which almost becomes a theme now within the charts I've already shown you. It's enabling our business to create more of its own learning for its own people. Now, for those people who've been doing digital learning for a while, they will know that that is fraught with challenges and difficulties and complexity. And sometimes it creates sort of content that doesn't necessarily drive great learning experiences. But it's where things are going. And I think it's reflected maybe of this creator economy, the TikTok, the kids putting their things, their dances on screen. I'm not sure if the dances translate into great learning, but it may create the habit of learning. If you can create the nuggets which just trigger somebody at the right time and they look at it every day. I had an interesting conversation with somebody just last week about learning engagement, and they said, it's all about releasing the dopamine. It's all about releasing that good feel-good factor that makes you want to come back. And you're competing with Instagram and TikTok for the eyeballs and the eye space. And actually, because we're in a working environment, it's more than just the hit of, actually, it was quite interesting just to see. We can use people as part of the dopamine hit of, I can give you positive feedback, I can give you reinforcement, I can give you encouragement to make you feel good, which makes you come back again. So that's really interesting to me, because I think there is again, nobody's saying they're going to do less of most stuff, right? Overall, the push is to be using more and more digital learning. I think that's not going anywhere. Now, we've asked you also, how effective is what you do with digital learning at delivering things like compliance training, personal development, onboarding and reboarding, a learning culture. Let's see, we've got upskilling, reskilling, business improvement, business transformation, career development, and extended enterprise. The green means that you're very effective. Yeah. Now, what you will notice is we're really good at compliance still. Okay, we're still good at compliance, and I'm reassured, but also slightly disappointed because I hope we've moved on. What is it about compliance? But there we go. It features so highly. Half of us say we're very effective at compliance. Maybe that was always the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I was going to say on that is that, digital was the only game in town, wasn't it, for a couple of years. And what we've done is we just accentuated, shifted whatever we could to it. We accentuated what we're doing. But in some ways, we've still not broken the kind of constraints around where we've largely applied stuff. So even though we've moved it across, we haven't necessarily done that necessarily in an effective way. And I think ultimately that's one of the biggest challenges we need to think about, is not just what drives good engagement with individuals, but what drives impact and efficacy as well.
Exactly. But I think it's really interesting, right? So if you think about the green and the blue, that's where we believe we're effective. And there's a really interesting item, it's about halfway down, where it's almost a third of us are ineffective, and that's around driving a learning culture using our digital learning. And I think that's a really sort of open-ended debate, and we could probably just break the conversation there and say, get into huddles and say, what role does digital learning have in forging a learning culture within your organisation? Does it have a role? Have you even defined a role for digital learning in your learning culture? And I think that's something that maybe for a third of us, we can actually really address in a focused way. Actually, for nearly 80% of us, there's room for improvement. And ultimately, if you don't have a great learning culture, learning doesn't really happen. That is the greatest barrier to somebody thinking, I've got a learning need, or am I going to do anything about it? So really think about that. I think overall, in some ways it's very disappointing that actually, less than 20% of us are great at doing upskilling. Only 20% of us, less than 20% of us are doing business improvement change. Very disappointing that actually career development is about 10%. We're very effective at. If you want to keep people, they need to build a future in your organisation. So that whole sense of talent mobility, and I know we're going to touch on that a little bit later, is hugely important. And I think it's an area of vulnerability for L&D teams, not to be driving the future career paths, but the individuals and the future potential of the organisation. There you go. Half of you are under more pressure to show value for money and show impact. And that's a big takeaway. Again, we know that it's been an area of immaturity across nearly all organisations. The ability to drive a return on investment and prove the value that's been added is very rarely shown. And it's a thorn to some extent in our sides.
Especially in a world where we say, we expect that we need to invest more in learning because ultimately with the changes we've got to support in the business are much bigger. But then go back to that point, the last thing, we're only probably 22% saying they're actually very effective at upskilling and reskilling. I'm not sure that's a message you want to take to your CEO. Quite effective doesn't strike me as a very strong story, and hides a multitude of sins as well. So, the question is it quite or is it effective? That's a career-defining answer, isn't it, really? And I think that's the challenge now for us as organisations, is going beyond the lowest common denominator and stepping up now and actually really engaging these things. And that question, that last slide was not about digital, that was around learning strategy. Yeah. So how effective is your learning strategy of doing these things? There's still huge room for improvement. But the time we have to sort this out has become really compressed. We're now trying to move at pace. Organisations are trying to shift. The expectation is higher. And then go forward to the next question. The visibility of, are you really adding value? Do your solutions work? Are you really supporting the business? Is probably under pretty much unparalleled pressure. Prove it. Yeah. Prove to me that you're adding value. Prove to me that we're reskilling and upskilling. And we'll come back and talk about the skills question.
And there's almost a bit of an irony in there, actually. Probably businesses have never had so much data about how they're performing and what they're delivering. Probably at any point in previous history of organisations. And our inability to connect to that data as a learning team is probably one of the fatal flaws of all the things in the exhibition downstairs to some extent. We're still not able to create that link between business outcome and what we do. But that's critical. And if you can do that, from my experience, you get loads more money coming your way, because everybody wants to improve performance, and then they see your ability to gear and leverage outcomes. So it's so incredibly important. It's not time to hide, I suppose. The other thing is just in terms of one of the themes that's come out consistently, and we asked it first time 2 years ago at the start of the pandemic, is are your learners experiencing digital learning fatigue, or are they experiencing more digital learning fatigue? And we've asked it again this year. The numbers aren't that much different from last year, to be honest. There's still this sense of, actually, it's becoming more of a problem. So 41% say that digital learning fatigue, going through another compliance course, which we're very good at delivering, is creating a little bit of stress, and people are getting tired of it, they feel a little bit bored. Only a 30-40%, which I put 59-40%, say it's no different from before the pandemic. Now, I take that to mean they were still experiencing fatigue before the pandemic to some extent, right? So if you read this in maybe a negative way, you'd say, well, yeah, that's about 80% who said, do you know what, our people, if you said, do you want to go through another e-learning course, they might run towards the door. And I think there is something, again, going back to that dopamine hit. What we're doing that raises the quality and creates the emotional connection to digital learning. That's a really high bar, and in the past, most of the reason we looked at using digital learning, maybe over the previous 15 years or 20 years, was to reduce cost and increase scale. What a wonderful answer to take to the CFO. But now the game's changed a little bit. As we use it more and more, we need to be able to make people want to come back more and more. And that is a real challenge for us. It's only less of a problem, 14%. I think if anybody's in that 14%, I should find out who they are. I want to know what they're doing. Yeah? And that's where we need to get to, almost trying to encourage you as a community to get together to say, what is it that people are doing that's really addressing issues of digital learning fatigue? And we're sort of trying to highlight a little bit through other research, but it's a community thing. And I think there is, to some extent, over the last 2 years, maybe a lack of sharing around some of the things that are really making a difference, and we probably need more of that. Just the other thing, just in terms of how advanced people are, again, just to sort of take away colours, green is advanced, orange is intermediate, blue is basic, and red is we don't do that. Okay, so really interesting. Who's good at or advanced in doing learning portals? We've got about 20%. If you say who's advanced in doing social and collaborative learning, we're down to about 12-15%. If you come down to actually doing campaigns to engage our remote learners, our hybrid workforce in learning at a personalised level, think about learner engagement, we're down to about 10%. Say they're advanced, right? Most, well, actually, I should put my hand on where the halfway market is. Most are really delivering a basic experience or nothing at all. And again, this is only reflective of what you've told us. It may be not necessarily reflective of your own individual experience, but maybe the call to action for us is to say, out of these things, and there's not everything is relevant, what it should be my priority. Now, to me, I think as an industry, not only as L&D professionals, the one that should be top priority is the one that's at the bottom.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if probably the hype word of 2022 is personalization, is the drive for everybody. So when we're talking to companies around, the learning they're offering, the learning that you as an individual get, the way it's delivered to you, etc., the systems that support it, personalization. If you walk downstairs, you'll see a lot of stuff around hyper-personalization. We're actually not very good. There are very few companies that have actually worked out how to do it systemically. And the vendors will talk a lot around it, but again, the challenge there is around really delivering it. The other one is, of course, you hear about learning in the flow of work. Right? So what does that really mean? How does that work? Is Teams a great example of a high-value learning environment? High-value, but again, workflow learning, again, most companies are really early stages in terms of what they're trying to do, and typically it's very limited. So what we didn't ask is, we said, are you doing this? Not, are you doing it systemically across the whole of your learning offer? Because then these will become more minuscule. So,
but then on the positive side, at least people are trying to do
we
things
started
and the level of basic levels, right? But I think what it gives us an indication is maybe there's an opportunity to raise our game. And actually that's not only raising our game as an D team, but also raise the expectations of our partners and providers to say, what are you going to do? What's on your roadmap? How do you make this execute? Can you connect me with a customer who's doing this well? That's probably one of the first questions I'd ask any new vendor that I was thinking about working. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to hope, even to our things that need intermediate level, right? This is a vague phrase, but I think it's an area that just gives us a chance to think, things to do. Just to go into a bit of detail, around personalisation, an area that we're not so strong around. Again, green's very personalised, and who wouldn't want something that's very personalised or at least partly personalised? If I said I've got a training course for you and it's really generic, everybody can do it, but it might necessarily be focused on what you want or need. I'm not sure if you put your hands up to do that. But again, if you go through this, the one down the bottom, which is very, very sort of least personalised in a way, are the e-learning courses that we share with everybody, and they get to go through everything that's not necessarily that differentiated to my needs and my motivations and my drivers and my outcomes. So for all the great things in here, again, quite personalised. You can't really see it. I'll probably chose the wrong colour. I should use blue. It's actually quite good in a way, but they're just trying to say there's an opportunity to improve. And I think if you think about all the things that are happening in commerce, if you're in an organisation that's involved in digital marketing, digital sales, everything is about the personalised user experience. So how we start to use the data to personalise and not only to deliver the content, but to nudge people to say, now would be a good time to go and speak to Steve. Yeah? That's all part of the nudging experience, the learning experience, which is driven by personalisation. I'm not sure if there's any of that. Both the skills management is one that stands out as well, in terms of we're under 40%, about 35% say that they have quite personalised skills management. It's not a great answer. Even the things around talent mobility. So my ability to know what future roles I could take advantage of now in the organisation. We are up to under 40%. Now, again, we're going to cover that a little bit later, but those are real sort of high trigger points. Here we go.
So, yeah, and I think the key point is to come back to that point about what's the best way of dealing with that fatigue. Make it relevant, make it personal, make it fit them, right? Make it worth their time doing it. And therefore, a lot of these things tie together. So the other thing we wanted to touch on, just kind of take a bit of a pivot really, is to think about the landscape that a lot of you are looking at now has sort of changed. It's not just about a learning culture and a catalogue and a set of offerings and so on. It's actually, there's a much bigger conversation going around skills in the organisation. Skills has hit the C-suite as a kind of issue, and it's become a kind of strategic way of looking at the problems, whether that's around our inability to hire skilled people, the need to upskill and reskill an organisation to realign to a post kind of whatever the business now looks like. You stop doing certain things, you bought others, you divested other bits. How do we realign the organisation to those? So the skills is a kind of macro story. And again, go downstairs, walk around the show. Discussions around skills everywhere. The problem we have with this is, so L&D kind of has a historic perception that it sort of owns skills in the organisation. The reality of that is not true. It's not owning or controlling that dialogue. Okay? It's being driven from a completely different level. And what we're trying to then really think about then is, okay, how is that conversation really unfurling? We know that this is important. I'll give some data that just validates that it's important, but what do we do about it? And how, from an L&D point of view particularly, do we become a much more senior partner in that conversation? Because at the moment, it's, if you're in a corporate L&D function, as part of a corporate HR function, it's HR that's going to drive the agenda around skills. It's recruiting that's driving the agenda around skills. It's not being driven so much from L&D, which is completely perverse if you think about it. If you've got 30 years of history investing on building learning solutions that help build skills in organizations, to not be part of that decision process is quite critical. We know this is hugely important. 75% of organizations say it's a high priority. 1%, only 1% say it's not a priority for them in some way. So it's kind of really stark. 79% saying they've got skills gaps today. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, we've got some great data from our recruiting side. You can't hire those people. All those people you couldn't hire before are now even more in demand, particularly if they've got digital or data science or whatever it is in their title. As every business has had to kind of move to become a digital business to some degree, the people you couldn't hire before, you still can't hire now. The other thing the pandemic proved to us is that critical talent suddenly meant people like bus drivers. And people on the front line who are doing things, right? All the logistics challenges because we didn't have enough lorry drivers in the UK, for God's sake. This skills issue is not just about high skilled, highly paid people. It's all levels, right? And it's a really kind of very strategic challenge. But the interesting point is when we look at how we kind of approach that, developing our own people turns out not to be our main strategy for addressing it. So come back to the L&D piece and its sense of ownership around skills. Partly the challenge is we're not filling those skills from people from within. And for a lot of your organizations, you've radically changed, right? You've stopped doing certain things. In Europe, we've tended to keep the staff, look to redeploy the staff, to upskill the staff. How do we do that effectively and fulfill those roles? This is still a huge issue around it. We still tend to, look to basically fulfill those roles by either recruiting people in externally if we can, but we can't do that either. And the pandemic really accelerated this. 58% of organizations talked about the importance of that skills conversation was massively, accelerated because of the pandemic. It's become a much more visible thing, and it's visible at C-suite level, not just within an HR or learning perspective. 56% of organizations accelerated their skills agenda. 40% increase started looking at things like talent mobility. One of the hottest spaces we're seeing across all the markets is talent mobility and opportunity marketplaces. Actually just saying what role, what is out there, and you may be doing projects and things to develop your capability. A lot of this is aligned, of course, to personal growth agendas, but it's also what holes have I got and who might want to fill those roles? How can we do that? How can we get much more mobile around that rather than just having very fixed internal career sites, for example, around things? Only 5% think they're very effective at matching people to opportunities. 5%. Right. So again, go back to the thing. We've gone into some of the specifics around the challenges in the digital data. But you've got real big problems on a macro level around it. Only 7% saying they have a fully integrated approach to skills. Right? And actually, often when we drill into that fully integrated approach is still not fully integrated yet, partial. So we've got some big challenges. The point that I would like to take away is that skills piece, it sort of powers the whole thing around organisation and people now. There's lots of people looking at this. This is our Fosway HCM model. So this is how we look at HR and talent and the wider landscape. Skills is pretty now foundational within the centre of this. Learning and development has massive vested interest around this and a huge capability to support it. But actually the drivers around this, and from a landscape point of view, from a technology point of view, the people making the biggest land grab for this, it's the Workdays and SuccessFactors of this world. It's the HCM suites. It's the recruiting platforms, or it's specialist, skills-based disruptors with AI engines and bits and pieces that are trying to plug in to work out what skills you have and what skills you have as an individual. This conversation is now embedded very firmly in the LXPs. It's embedded in the talent platforms, and it's embedded in the HR platforms. The problem is nobody wants to share. Everybody's got the best AI, except they haven't. And nobody wants to share, nobody wants to play nice. And the view that we have around skills and performance is largely based on HR measures, not business measures. It's not based on how many problems you've solved, how many things you've sold, how many customers, how happy your customers are. It's based on internal measures from within the HR system that tells you, I have skills because I passed this course. What value does that really have from the real business level? So there's some really kind of there's a very big thing going on outside the L&D space, and L&D needs to be a much bigger player within that. And ultimately, that comes down to it thinking around, so we're thinking around a lot, which is around skills intelligence, which is how do you really build the best view of the skills that we need in the organisation, we have in our people, we want to develop and so on. Being able to connect the dots together and to think about the programs we create, the people we hire, the opportunities we create and deliver for them. The biggest biggest driver to personal growth is not attending a training course, strangely. It's doing the work. How do we join those dots together, but in a way with a consistent view and the best insight? Because there's a lot of people that have quite bad skills intelligence embedded in their systems. And as I said, nobody really wants to share that, and they don't connect together. So skills is really at a macro level. If you think about the conversation, what Dave was talking about, the patterns we're seeing, ultimately how that all then aligns together and then feeds up into that wider skills intelligence and to the skills management strategy that you have as an organization is really important. So all of the things we've just talked about really ultimately come down to what do you do, what are your strategies, where do you invest, and who are your partners, and how does that impact them? So I want to think just at the end of this, really just to talk a little bit around the impact on the partners and in terms of the way that we look at them. So all the things we've just talked about, every year we kind of zero base effectively the research process. So many of you will be familiar with things like the Fosway 9 grids, the sort of paint splattered charts, is that the term I'm supposed to use? No? That describe the capabilities of the vendors and their ability to service it. There are some copies at the front if anybody's interested in taking some of those away. I just wanted to touch on some of the impact and how this is playing into the vendor landscape. So, I mean, at an overall level, so David is the lead analyst, he's got questions around digital learning, he's the lead analyst for this stuff, but from an overall point of view, the pandemic has been a massive driver for digital learning vendors. If they're growing at 10%, it probably means they're losing market share. So there's been it's still kind of boom times for them. But as David has already said, and showed you the evidence around it, it's still kind of to a large degree lowest common denominator, base level solutions. There were some really interesting data points. There's a lot of other stuff which we couldn't include today because we didn't have time. Talking about what do people need to do to actually kind of really make those specific, sort of more impactful, more personalised and so on. Digital fatigue is real. Yeah, learning through work is now non-negotiable, but as we've said before, not many people are mature at doing it in any meaningful way. It's more hype than substance still for most organisations. And then ultimately the skills landscape. So it kind of reflects quite nicely. These are the comments we did in our Ask the Analyst sort of summary around the digital language, but actually they really kind of line back to some of the points in the data. David, anything you want to make around the vendors from that?
Yeah, just thinking about the digital learning fatigue, I think something that we tend to think about digital learning as being about the content, but there is something that wraps around that in terms of things like diagnostic tools. There are things around how we nudge people to make more human connections. And I think actually one of the biggest challenges for us is how we think about technology augmenting learning, augmenting human connection. And we talk quite frequently about learning cycles. So that whole process of input, that could be from a person as much as it could be from digital learning, action, feedback, and reflection. And actually at each one of those stages, there is an opportunity to use a digital aspect to help you through that process. But I think what we've done in the past is focus so much around the content. What we haven't done is really leverage the sort of human footprint fingerprints on the experience and actually try and create things that are more engaging, because actually there's more emotional engagement within that process. And I think that's one of the things I pick out specifically around that digital learning fatigue. It's about the consumption. And I think that maybe is one of the interesting things from the feedback from the survey itself, is the focus on user-generated content. If you use that as part of the learning journey, or actually as a team, you're going to create some asset that you're going to give to others. Actually, you've got a purposeful, user-generated focus on creating things that other people can use. So again, that creates a human connection in the learning journey. I think that's one of the most interesting things to think about, of actually how many of these digital learning providers also talk to you about the social, collaborative engagement approach around digital learning, not just the how much you're going to spend on me to create content or provide you with a platform.
And I think the more we focus on digitally enabled everything, and in particular look at the higher value, beyond that base level, the more that all of those other elements come into play. And typically when we're looking at the vendors, what we're trying to do is to understand who gets that, who has the capability to support that, or are they just delivering one kind of piece of it, and it's constantly a moving target. The other thing I would say is around this, and it probably applies to the next one as well, the most overused word in the room is experience. right? It could be because in reality, it's not because it's not important, it's just because most of the experience isn't very good. Yeah, and we can keep putting the word experience on the end of it, we have to make it mean something, right? We have to understand what experience means, and then for the individual, for their context. Yeah, it's their experience. In reality, it's most people's. We look at this a lot within HR, and everybody talks about employee experience. And most employees' experience is how crap their manager is, and how bad their work is, and do they really get to work from home when they want to, or all those things. It isn't. It isn't. How nice is the user interface on my HR system? Strangely enough. Right? And I think we're really guilty of this within learning. We think about creating great learning experiences, but actually that's like in the eye of the beholder. A lot of great experiences aren't very great. Okay, but it's constantly something that we want to do. From a learning systems point of view, obviously what we've seen is, as we've seen that increasing fragmentation and the more different types and trying to blend together all these different elements, that's also overtaking the systems as well and their ability to manage and put all of that jigsaw together and to deliver that in a personalised, relevant way to people at the point in time they want to need it. Whether that's driven by, I have a problem to solve, I need that answer now, or how do I build my capability, my career in the company, whatever that lens is. Discovery is not the only lens here. Right? There are other lenses that are important around it. So we're seeing, again, because strong growth, loads of new entrants. Go and walk down the show downstairs. How many people have you never heard of and have got a stand that's half as big as this room? There's lots of new players. This is the mid-market here across the mid-enterprise space. Typically that 3 to 10K, 3 to 15K organizations, they're trying to sell to all the same. Look how crowded it is. Look how many new entrants there are that, again, you say you've not heard of. The specialists that are playing in that just do lots of things. And in reality, if you're a large, complex enterprise organization, the number of options you've got actually hasn't changed that much. There's not that many players really executing well at that big level. They can do it selectively, but not systemically, not with complex organizations. So skills is, massively all over this story. War for talent in the vendors. So you'll see lots of people who are now on different stands downstairs, you might know. Right? Because there's a war for talent in the vendors, both for R&D and developers, but also for salespeople, for customer success, for etc. as well. There's a lot of pressure in that. Personalization is more than just recommendations. We stop talking about a Netflix experience. Netflix has got nothing to do with learning. Right? Knowing which film you might want to watch is great, but knowing whether you can actually do a job afterwards, you've watched it, is a whole different thing. Right? So it's personalization of recommendations is relevant. Right? It's not saying it's irrelevant. What we're saying is there's a lot more to personalization around it. We need to think about what drives outcomes, what is effective, and that's going to be different for me than Steve and Dave. So thinking about what that means. And then lastly, the other key thing we talk about, the more we've looked at this, the more we think about it as an ecosystem, not a system. It's not about an LMS and content, it's about a much bigger jigsaw and how it all fits together. So, the data behind these 9 grids comes from lots of places. It mainly comes from you, from corporates, and their view of the experiences they have with different vendors. We run a lot of deep research, public research. Each of the 9 grid processes is an absolute monster. We of course do lots of vendor briefings and customer references and everything else as well. But there's a lot of data that goes behind all of that. But the dominant view is what the corporates say, right? That goes into those 9 grids. And just a kind of final point from me is, the 9 grid is a tip of an iceberg of analysis around what it is. If you are making decisions, and you're making complex decisions, come and talk to us, because we can actually help you understand the stories beneath that and what maybe is the right fit for you. The final thing I just wanted to do just before we go to questions is, so the digital learning 9 grid, we've actually got physical copies at the front. We've also got copies of the just a summary, like infographic around some of the digital learning research. There's actually a QR code on the bottom. And if you actually scan that, you can get access. There's a quick reg and you get access directly to an infographic that relates to it today. Also, you can get access to the full reports on the 9 grid. So if you're looking at solutions downstairs, you can get access to the full report very quickly. The digital learning realities research David's talked about the data from is still live. We'll probably close it at the end of May. So there's an opportunity please add your view. If it doesn't reflect what your view or experiences are, come and tell us. That's what we're trying to do. So we're really interested in doing that. Final piece that I wanted to just also touch on, we're in your conference pack, some of you may have seen them. One of the things that we've started to do, we get a lot of requests from the corporates about attending some of the things like the private roundtables we're doing, the analyst sessions and so on. One of the things we will be announcing soon, it's not really announced yet, that is a thing which is called the Fosway Success Network. So we do a lot of work with the larger corporates to help them challenge their strategy, critique their strategy, identify and accelerate some of them thinking about the options. But one of the things we find is, especially with the stopping doing physical events and physical roundtables, is there's an opportunity to do a lot more of that virtually as well. So this is not going to stop us publishing all the research. It's just an opportunity to engage more deeply with it, aimed at individuals who are trying to accelerate their understanding or want access to some of David's time or whatever it is behind the scenes. So if that's of interest, there's a QR code. Again, it's an invite only, so it's only available for corporates. There's a kind of filtered process around it. But if you're interested in doing that, you can use the QR code again to do that. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The two Davids, they're the greatest tag team in learning technology. So while you're taking time to absorb all that, I mean, that was quite a journey through a lot of data there. Can I ask a question to start with, and then we'll go around with the roving mics. We've got one that side and one this side. Just put your hand up. But can I start by asking you a question about the digital learning fatigue question? It seems to me there's a lot more than behind this, isn't there? I mean, we could analyse, we could excavate this for quite some time, but just as a simple question, have you got any data to show whether digital learning fatigue is related to things like electronic page turning or sitting for too long in front of a Zoom meeting? What kind of data have you got?
We haven't dug into that level of detail. What we've done so far is just try to highlight the issue, and that's almost a debate and a conversation and a whole new project in its own right. We haven't dug into it, I'm sorry to say. So
well, I think we can talk about correlation. Right?
Well, let's talk about correlation.
Yeah, so
it's not causal.
Exactly.
It's
and that's a very important point to an analyst, finding about what's causal and what's correlated. So I think what we know is organisations, so go back and Dave was talking about the personalisation journey, we talked about what are we effective at doing. There's definitely a correlation between higher digital fatigue and I would call lowest common denominator solution, right? Which comes back to what you're saying. If typically companies have got pretty flat, what I call a traditional e-learning model, which does have very limited personalisation around that significantly increases the level of digital fatigue that they have. Once you then go beyond that, then start to look at, we have also things around satisfaction. Actually, I'll talk about a couple of slides out there, which is looking at, looking at satisfaction around different content strategies and so on. Again, you can see correlations. So organisations that have higher fatigue, also tend to have more use of kind of more basic resources, not very personalised in the way it's delivered. It's very push rather than pull, and so on. But I think there's a whole opportunity to kind of deconstruct that a lot further, as David was saying.
And just to add to that, Steve, I think what we know is that if you go and talk to suppliers who have maybe specialise more in more immersive learning approaches, maybe things like spaced repetition, adaptive learning, they will talk about higher levels of employee engagement, higher levels of retention, higher levels of almost learner satisfaction. So there is something out there within the community from providers and end users that says actually a more immersive learning experience can be successful. And we've done some work recently with a consulting organisation, and it's interesting when you sort of start to dig into examples which are really available related to companies like Itsu, the Japanese food chain. They've used immersive approaches around their learning, and it's driven higher I suppose end user satisfaction, where people joining Itsu, and those people have stayed longer in the organisation. So that data exists out there. We don't have it at the moment, but I think, again, it's an interesting part of the information's out there. That immersive area is something that I think is something we probably all need to investigate a little bit more.
I think so. It's certainly another level of excavation about the problems that we experience. And I think it seems to me from what you're saying, it's not about the technology, it's about the methodology underneath it, the way that we help people to learn through that technology. Yeah,
so things like scenario-based gaming,
learning,
games-based learning, things that you involve maybe virtual environments, ability to practice and rehearse in those sorts of environments. We know that drives high levels of retention and engagement. I couldn't tell you the numbers because it varies a little bit from case study to case study.
One for the content developers there to think about. Question from the front here.
Yeah, I'm interested in your remark about the unclarity about learning in the flow of work. So if you read Josh Berson's work, he puts every LXP in learning in the flow of work. But yesterday I saw David Kelly splitting it up in workflow learning systems and LXPs as different categories. If you read the work of Bob Mosier, it's about learning while working and not learning through working, as you said. So what is your perspective about the evolution of the whole learning in the flow of work?
So, I mean, let's answer it on two levels. On a macro level, for me, the most important thing we have to integrate learning with is work. It's not with talent, it's not with HR, it's not with skills, it's with work. Because the moment you do that effectively, you generate, real value for the individual and for the company, right, or for the organisation. The challenge is how do you do that well, right? And I think we've got caught into a little bit of a hype cycle. So we show you a diagram from 2008 which talks about that stuff, right? So this is not new, as you know, right, because of your prior incarnations as well, I think. So I think the reality is, how do we do that well, right? And I made a flippant comment around shoving lots of learning into teams. Obviously, Microsoft has got a strategy with Viva to make Teams a landing point for learning, but Viva's Teams is a very suboptimal place to learn. And it's very crowded, it's very noisy. There's lots of conflicting things. And I don't know about you, but I'm not really that interested in working with somebody where their competence is one video ahead of me in the YouTube list. I want people that are, who are capable and proven competent to be working on things that I'm paying them to work on, or whatever it is. So I think we have to think about this in a much more macro sense as well. The other thing then is just come back to that, is then looking at the kind of specifics, is understanding the strategies of how we integrate those things together. I think is really kind of, we have to get much more granular around it. And then come back to that word experience. How do we understand, how do we do that in a way that actually creates a very positive experience and a positive outcome? So,
I think for me it's interesting because I think there is that sense of, this is the first year where we haven't put a diagram up which looks like a large flower, right? And it talks about three segments. It talks about formal learning, it talks about workplace learning, and it talks about collaboration. On each one of those, there's an overlap, because your formal learning can overlap into workplace learning. Workplace learning can lap over into collaboration, and collaboration can lap over into formal learning. Now, what's interesting is when you start to say, well, what is workplace learning? That's performance support, that's feedback, that's having peer-to-peer mentoring, it's coaching. There's all these things that say, yeah, that's naturally part of learning through work. It's actually having an assignment with an action community, that maybe an action-based learning community, trying to solve a real problem. That is workplace learning, that is learning through work, and it can bleed into those other segments, the formal learning and the collaborative learning. So I think it's the broad hype of the LXP being workflow learning, it's BS, right? We know what works as workplace learning. It's giving people a chance to work on real projects and supporting them at the point of need, or helping them prepare for that point of need through rehearsal and practice. And that involves humans, it involves content, it involves support. And if we think of it through the persona in personalization, I think we find it much easier to create those sorts of things. So I'm sort of with David. I think there's some really interesting things that might come out of Microsoft Teams. I can imagine Cortana suggesting to me that it's been 3 weeks since I topped up on the piece of knowledge that I should be really good at and my scores are low, and saying, you're this quartile, go and do a bit more. Like it's reminding me that I didn't answer this email, right? I'm getting that in Outlook now. It's not too far away from that to apply. And that's part of learning work as well. So this sort of learning through work, workflow learning, I think there's too many parts to it.
I've travelled over to another county now. We're over this side, outside broadcast here.
Thanks, Tar. I'm Meredith Roller from Deutsche Post DHL. Hello. Actually, I had a question because I'm a huge fan of the personalisation piece and really we're investing a lot of time and effort to build the architecture and the infrastructure to make that work. Where we're facing a huge challenge is around data privacy, the whole GDPR, and not so much where we are today with GDPR, but where it's heading. And I just wondered if you had any thought or comment on how do we manage that? It's not the same in the consumer world, right? We're talking about an internal labour market, and I wonder what your thoughts are there.
It's almost the world's moving in two different directions. There has to be something in terms of the ongoing conversation with the people who are setting the legislation and the assurances, for example, with the workers' councils and the people in your organisation that actually the data is not being used to disadvantage, it's being used to enable and empower. And I think that's a fundamental debate that probably is bigger than this room, but it's a debate that needs to be taken to those people who are bringing in the legislation, because we want to offer maybe a more flexible, more agile working environment. We want to give people more choice, and not only give them more choice, but give them access to the choice. Yeah, and actually also overcome people's maybe limiting beliefs, maybe their sense of I'm not ready for that job, for example. We can start to promote things to communities, individuals, regardless of their background, which enables, and I think it's really interesting, it's almost the legacy of Cambridge Analytica is driving us into an area which is closing the world down, and we need almost the sort of the polar opposite of that Cambridge Analytica story to be actually data can empower and release individuals' potential, unleash their full capability regardless, right? And I think we need to try and hopefully encourage organisations and the legislature to move in that direction, but is there going to be a bit of a hurdle still?
I think, Meredith, the other thing I'd add on that is that it's kind of interesting, we're in the tech world where most things seem to originate in Silicon Valley, or a lot of the thinking, a lot of creative. I mean, in a couple of months' time, Dave and I are probably in HR Tech doing briefings with companies you've never heard of, talking about their latest AI thing and how it's going to conquer the world. And whilst the climate's changing in the US, understanding what is legal, let alone ethical, and how that applies is something that needs to be designed in a much more cosmopolitan, much more worldly way than just within I don't know 10 miles of Silicon Valley, or in Texas if you've moved there for tax reasons. The other thing I was going to say is there is no personalization without data, right? So the cusp for your problem there is absolutely valid, but obviously the interpretation around that is different from organisation to organisation. I think one of the things that we found in the past is that organisations in exactly the same business sector, in exactly the same countries, make different decisions around data internally about what's legal and what isn't. There's quite a lot of interpretation and not a lot of case law around this as well. And I think, therefore, for you, obviously at DPDHL, with the German heartland core challenge, right? They've probably got some of the most restrictive view around it from what data you can use from a workers' council point of view, with very onerous approvals around how those change. We also find problems with companies where they have data sovereignty challenges, of course, as well. If you want to do this in Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East, or you want to do it in Russia or Brazil, where's that data going to be sourced? Not anybody wants to do it in Russia. So I think it is a real issue, and
the legislation, as David was kind of pointing out, we're so far away from focusing on the problems you're trying to solve in the restrictions that are limiting you.
Question over here.
Thanks for your insights. You mentioned earlier in some of your responses that the biggest driver to growth, professional, personal, is not the course, it's not the learning, it's the work, right? So can you give us any examples? Have you heard from any L&D practitioners that have successfully measured impact, long-term measured that skills application, and bonus points if they actually were able to link it to business impact?
We're looking at this from a number of different angles. We're looking at it obviously within the L&D world, but we're also looking at it in the wider talent space as well. So, one of the things that there are different genders here, right? So there are things that are being driven by what makes your people happier and what makes them stay with you is one thing versus what actually delivers a better business outcome. And it's a very complex problem. To go back to that matrix that I showed with with that hexagon diagram, there are lots of pieces to that jigsaw and they don't join up, right? There's not even a consistent view of what skills means across the organization. So there are definitely organizations that are looking at this in silos, I would say, where they're looking at specific strategies around that, tying that to, looking at the skills issue, looking at maybe what drives employee growth and maybe retention. But that's not the same as what drives sales performance or project delivery, execution, and NPS for the customer. So I think we're still in the early days of trying to join those dots up, to be honest. They're case studies, they're really good case studies.
There's some good case studies.
But in parts, you find bits of the silos where they're solving it.
Question over here now.
Thanks. I work in fintech and we're doing a lot of work on collaboration at the moment and communities of practice. I wondered if you'd seen an increase in the interfaces between, hardcore L&D systems and knowledge management systems.
Yes, I think it's always been there's never been a hard boundary between the two, and it seems to be coming closer together. And that is again about the contextualization of information to work. And I think that's where things seem to be sort of almost converging even more. So at the point of work where you start to talk about performance support tools, if you've not started to follow what Josh Novell's been doing at Time Warner around performance support, well worth trying to reference and look up, because there's some really interesting things about what information did you need to perform that transaction. And sometimes it's a people-focused transaction, sometimes it's a work transaction. It's just the things that you might have forgotten in the journey, right? Now, is that knowledge management? Is it performance support? Probably the same thing, but I think that's an area actually, when you start to get into the sense of what do people need to feel successful at work, then maybe the label doesn't matter too much as long as they've got their hands on it. And I think traditionally maybe it's been an area that's been underserved by both banks, so both camps for the individual. But some really interesting things with Josh Novell, and it's just in the system at the point of need, the help is there.
The other piece of this is communication as well. So one of the problems in the past, so when I first started Fosway 25.5 years ago, nearly 26 years ago, we're looking at collaborative learning, knowledge management, distributed learning teams, etc. and so on, and not actually CBT. Used to be old school about talking around it, right? So not CBT, and so I'm really interested in those things. What happened is they took divergent paths in reality, and we tech-enabled all of those, but in parallel universes, and I think that's true. A lot of the knowledge management agenda that was very strong at that point in time then got kind of very diluted. But, and then you had a separate function focusing on learning and then a separate function on internal communication. And actually they're all parallel universes that didn't quite overlap and intersect. So I think, the coalescence of those things and viewing them more as a continuum makes much more sense. I think the other thing is just go back to some of the things we're talking about, the trends within it. What we're seeing is significant growth and interest in around, particularly as you look at higher value learning, collaboration is fundamental to it. Right? You're never going to develop really high level skills by just learning from a book or a video or whatever, right? You have to, the other thing is coaching, right, which is the other piece of that as well. So if you go downstairs again, you're suddenly seeing a bunch of coaching providers turn up with quite big stands as well. So, there's a coalescence that's coming across around all these things. And I think, the knowledge management journey is it's interesting. I've had that from 2 or 3 companies in the last probably month or so, which it kind of been missing probably for a lot of the last 10, 15 years.
But then also the discipline, the sector that you're in, and actually knowledge management when you're working on building an airliner. And that side of things becomes very different from knowledge management if it's maybe a customer services sales environment, right? There's a level of implication of having the wrong knowledge in the wrong place at the wrong time, which means things didn't fly. And that sort of level of compliance is probably another lever onto it. So again, these problems tend to be multidimensional and contextual. But again, that takes us back to that sense of persona. What was needed both by the individual but also for the organisation.
We've got time for one more question, I think. So at the front here.
I wondered on the advanced, basic and intermediate if there was any criteria around that. So what things are you seeing, hearing users doing or learning and development practitioners doing? And I'm thinking along the lines of other models that are out there like Towards Maturity Now, Mind Tools, about the transformation curve and what those stages are.
To be honest, it's still an area that we haven't dug into enough. We gave people very arbitrary labels of, is it advanced, intermediate, basic, or you're not doing it? And that was really just to do a simple temperature check. I think the reality around what advanced meant to each individual, that's a really quite long piece of string, right? So somebody who thought they were basic might have been felt so they're advanced by somebody else. So we haven't qualified it, we never qualified it when we asked the question in a way. So in some ways it's holding up a mirror a little bit. And I think that then what the realities are, what should people be focusing on to raise the quality of learning experience then becomes, so where are you weakest, really, in terms of what will drive value for your learners when you speak to them.
Yeah, I think one important point here is that, so that public survey level, if you like, and some of the things that drive some of the sound bites and things that we're talking about here and some of that analysis, I think there's a lot of real value to it, but it's just one lens of looking at it. One of the things that we are also doing is obviously the deeper research. We're saying show me. I think, and you referenced obviously with Towards Maturity, and I think the danger is that we overplay, sometimes the way we interpret that data. Self-assessed capability that's not validated by anybody externally is still only self-assessed, right? So you said you were advanced, somebody else said they were basic, actually they meant the same. They kind of, the basic was better than the advanced, but we will never know that. And I think when you actually look at it, we see this with the vendors, of course, they will claim to be, market leading, right? And lots of things. But actually when it comes down to the assessment process, we try and, when we're doing the functional capture processes around a 9 grid, we get all of these things, we ask them to self-rate. None, some, partial, full, through partner, market leading. But then we can gain the data, right? Because funny enough, some of the vendors are market leading in quite a lot of things, even though they may not be. Right? But I think the thing is, we're always then assessing them to go show them. So we'll make the judgment about where we think they are. It's just their input. I think that applies a lot to this as well. So it's in the eye of the beholder, right? And with corporates particularly, they can be, sometimes they underplay what they're good at, sometimes they can overplay it, sometimes they can apply it's across everything. In other cases, they're very specific. We only do that for one thing. I always remember looking at what's the ATD data around how many people did level 5, ROI research or whatever, sort of things. And you say, 60% of companies do that, like how they do. Right? Maybe they do it for one thing, right? But they don't do it systemically whatsoever. So I think, just be careful around, obviously, I think it's a really valid question, what's advanced versus what? And I think we can look again for correlation and pattern, and those that are experimenting with certain things are more likely to. One stat that isn't on there, which we've used before, that was really important, digital maturity really matters. If the more experience you've got, the easier it was to adapt, for example, in pandemic, the more successful. If you're immature, you're much more likely to say it's hard to do. So I think there is something around being more advanced on that curve.
And I think just to add to that, I think there is this sense of when we speak to people who we know are more advanced and more experienced around digital learning, things they're pushing the envelope around are not on creating more of the old stuff. They're starting to pull the elastic a little bit, and they're starting to think, how can we create more immersive, more engaging learning experiences, which is more efficient, use-based repetition, more adaptive, more gamified, or games-based, more scenario-based. That's where they're starting to almost extend some of their reach, because they know that they need to keep people engaged in a way that hybrid workforce just keep giving the boring stuff over and over and over again. We're going to see diminishing returns on their willingness to engage with learning. So they're highlighting some areas and thinking, actually, we can raise our game around the important stuff. And I think that's where you almost get that sort of cross-narrative of the data tells us one thing, but then you get a few anecdotal stories from talking to a few expert organisations to say, okay, you're really trying to raise the bar now. And that sort of when you validate or path validates some of that.
Thank you. We have come to the end of the session. We've run out of time, as always with a good session. And I always say to my research students, like, research is great because you can find some answers, but it's going to raise a lot more questions and answers, and that's what you've done today. So I'd like to thank both David Perring and David Wilson for a wonderful session. Thank you.